All right, everyone. We're here with another episode of the Public Relations Declassified live stream. And we've got a little bit different format here today. We're going to be going over several topics in the PR world, a lot of advice that we're going to be sharing, but also we've got an interview here with a good friend of mine, Dr. Carlos Garcia, who's going to be sharing some insight on one of the topics that we're going to be talking about, kind of from an outside perspective. So first up, we're going to talk about the WordPress PR crisis. There's a little bit of an update here. Essentially, what has happened recently. Actually, before we jump into that, I want to share how absolutely awesome Grok is. This is something we've been using for some of these images. This is something that I put together. I had Grok basically build out this image of Matt Mullenweg, who is the founder of WordPress, basically burning the logo to the ground, and it's just puts out some absolutely insane graphics. But you guys have seen me covering the WordPress crisis a bit since it started last year. And essentially, this is a case study of what happens when you do everything wrong in the middle of a PR crisis. Throughout this, Mullenweg has become increasingly unhinged as the various events have unfolded. But what's interesting now is there is this class action lawsuit that was just filed by Ryan Keller over automatic interference with WordPress Engine's clients, right? WP Engine's clients. Ryan was one of those clients, as I am as well, and many other people. And essentially, if you aren't in the loop on that, what happened was due to this dispute where WordPress was essentially demanding 8% of WP Engine's revenue just for the right to use the word WordPress in their description of their services. As a result of the complaint, the conflict there, everything that happened there, essentially Automatic blocked WP Engine's clients, all of their hosting clients, from all of the security updates, right? The plugins, core, everything that you would update within your WordPress site, they completely blocked them out of that, preventing them from updating the website, which led to security issues, right? On top of that, they also stole a plugin called ACF, or Advanced Custom Fields, and then illegally installed software on people's websites. So huge, huge issues here. And this actually highlights an interesting thing that I have not seen before, and that is that this is the first ever decline in WordPress usage, right? WordPress has been pretty steadily going up for as long as it's been around. But as a result of this, and what you'll see up here in this chart, that red line is actually the enterprise level customers, right? These are some of the top websites, and I can't quite see it, but I think it's the top 50. But these are the very high profile sites, enterprise level companies or organizations. And as a result of all of this conflict that's happened because of the WordPress PR crisis, a lot of larger organizations are getting away from WordPress, right? It's just not worth the risk. It's not worth the danger that comes with it for them. And so this highlights the importance of handling a PR crisis properly, right? So if you find yourself in a situation like this, the first thing you have to do is develop an effective strategy. This is something that I talked about in an article that I wrote for Entrepreneur a while back. Chrissy, in fact, if you could pull that up and drop that into the Facebook group when you get a second, I'd appreciate that. But developing a strategy is the first part of this action plan, right? We need to decide what we're going to do. Well, first we decide if we're going to do anything, right? Because in a lot of cases, there could be a situation where it just doesn't make sense to respond. In other cases, you absolutely have to. But you have to figure out which path you need to take there, and then you need to figure out how you're going to respond. And then from there, you have to actually follow that strategy. In this case, Matt has done none of that, just basically operated on whims and very emotional driven, really did not handle things well. In the middle of a PR crisis, you want to do your best to take emotions and ego out of the equation. And that's really difficult because if it's your business, you're going to take that personally. It's going to mean something to you. So you want to be careful. And this is a really good example of why it's a great idea to have somebody who's not quite so tied to the company the way that you might be, as it's your baby. He did not do any of that, basically operated on an emotional level. He blocked and attacked everyone who criticized him. And then as things got worse, he blocked people who didn't sing his praises, right? If they weren't not just not criticizing him, but if they weren't standing up and saying, he's the best thing in the world and he made the internet, blah, blah, blah. If the people who were not praising him enough, he even started blocking them. So it got really messy, so much so to the point where he had even admitted specific crimes in his response on X. And a lot of those things did show up in some of the subsequent discovery phases of the lawsuit. And up to this point, he's pretty much got his hands slapped throughout all of the court proceedings for his behavior. So this is a great example of how easy it is to spin out of control. This is a guy who is running a $400 million plus enterprise. And he just let emotions take over and is essentially burning it to the ground. So if you find yourself in a situation like this, you have to have a solid strategy. You have to follow that strategy, and you have to be guided by the strategy and not your emotions. And if you can't do that, you need to have somebody handle it for you that's not going to have that same level of attachment. And this doesn't only happen with giant companies. I've seen this happen with small mom and pop companies as well. Obviously, the stakes are smaller, but the impact to the people involved is still just as big. All right, next up, we are going to talk about killing imposter syndrome. Now, I think we've all heard of imposter syndrome to some degree. Essentially, what it is, at its core, imposter syndrome is a level of insecurity. And we all face this to some degree. And the reality, hopefully this will make some of you guys feel better, is the smarter that you are, the more likely that you are to actually feel imposter syndrome. There's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect that is kind of, the whole thing is built upon. And think about it like this. In the beginning, you start working in an industry. At the very beginning, you know that you don't know shit, right? So as you start to learn stuff, you now know exponentially more than you did before. And that creates this false sense of confidence because you've now learned so much more than you knew just a few, maybe weeks, months, years, whatever. But your confidence skyrockets in the beginning. But what happens is over time, you start to realize as you continue to learn more and more and more, you start to realize, holy shit, back when I thought I knew so much, I didn't know shit. Like now I know 5 times more, 10 times more, whatever it is. And then that's when your confidence starts to drop. And it's not until you've been doing something for a really, really long time to where you start to have that confidence go back up and back up to a significant level, right? So this is something I've seen people run into all the time. Case in point, back when I used to run my agency as a full service agency, one of the core things that we did was search engine optimization. And I had hired this guy who he had basically stalked me first online and then in real life. And I was out for a walk in the parking lot one day and I kind of saw him creeping around, and then he drove up to me and he's like, "Jeremy?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "I've been following your work for years." And he's like, I really want an opportunity to work for you. And so I found out that he had worked for somebody that I knew, and for whatever reason, they had parted ways. I did ask that person. It was somebody fairly prominent in that industry. And I didn't get he didn't give me any, anything bad about the guy. He just kind of said, he's a good guy. He, give it a shot, whatever. But I asked the kid, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you feel like like what is your level of understanding when it comes to SEO? And this kid was like, "Oh, well, I worked for so-and-so and I got to see everything firsthand under him. And I think I'm easily, a 6, 7, maybe an 8. And I'm thinking, all right, awesome. This is great. I need somebody like that to handle some of these certain things to take off my plate. And as we started getting into the work, I quickly realized that he did not have that level of skill. And what it was is he was fairly early in that career and he had learned a few things. And now he thought he knew everything. In reality, he was probably a 1 or a 2 on a good day. But it's that early phase of the Dunning-Kruger effect that really skewed his perspective. And eventually it ended up resulting in him losing the job. And I don't know that he's done anything in the industry since then. So it's a very dangerous situation. But I want to highlight that it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't know a lot. Like, you probably are more of an expert than you realize. So I want to talk about some of the myths here. I see a lot of people who think, well, I have to know everything before I can get out there and start talking about it, whether that be posting on social media or being featured in the media about it. You're an expert to someone, and that someone is probably a lot more people than you realize, because if you're in an industry and you're working all day, every day in that, then you may not be an expert to some of your peers, but you're probably an expert to the people in different industries who you're going to serve. So keep that in mind. Your expertise is probably far greater than you realize. The other thing I want you to remember is you don't have to be declared an expert by another person or organization. Now, I say you don't have to be, but it does help. And that's the whole purpose of public relations, right? Now, it used to be the case where if you were just some rando that nobody else had vouched for, you wouldn't really be considered an expert. But that's not really the case, because social media and technology has changed that. Today, you are the media. Every one of us is or should be a media outlet, so to speak. Now, the other thing I want to highlight is this thing that I see a lot of, in some cases good intention, in other cases bad intention, people saying, and that is this whole fake it till you make it concept. And that is absolute bullshit. That's going to end up damaging your reputation in such a huge way, because frankly, it is fraud. And if you're faking it, you're probably going to say something that's false or incorrect, even flat out stupid. There was a guy who had this little kind of fake it till you make it approach that he used on the SEO forums back in the day. And I can't for the life of me remember the guy's name. Maybe somebody who's watching remembers who I'm talking about once I start telling the story, and you can drop his name in the chat. But what he would do is he would go on the forums where people were asking certain questions about SEO. If he saw it on one forum, he would go to a different forum, ask that question, and then get the answer, and then come back over to the first forum where he saw the question and now answer it, acting as if he's the expert. Well, pretty quickly, people caught on to that and they called him out, and it absolutely destroyed his reputation in that industry. Funny story about that. Somebody ended up finding a porn video of him on Pornhub, which further was, put the last nail in the coffin for his reputation. But, faking it till you make it is a bad approach, because you are going to fuck up your reputation. So you want to avoid that at all costs. Don't speak above what you know. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about how to get over imposter syndrome. And the first part of this is you really cannot get over it entirely. But you can minimize it. You can reduce it by getting outside of your bubble. When you're always around people in your industry, you're surrounded by expertise, and everything is relative. So if you're around people who have been doing this for 15, 20 years, and you've only got 5 years under your belt, well, of course, you're going to feel like you don't know what the hell you're talking about. But you go out to the people who, let's say you serve a particular industry. Maybe you work with lawyers, or you work with construction companies, whatever, and you're providing technology. Well, you may not be an expert in a room full of IT experts, but you go out to a room full of lawyers, and there's a pretty damn good chance that you're going to be able to explain things that they could never figure out on their own. You can help them understand things. You can tell them things they didn't know about, right? So get out of that bubble, and that changes perspective in a huge way. And then teaching others is a great approach as well, because this distills your thoughts on a topic. And when you're teaching non-experts, that forces you to understand the topic better. This is how education in the military worked, right? All the way down at the small unit level, we would constantly be training and teaching people. And, you're a young kid, 18, 19 years old. You've got men under your chain of command that you're now responsible for educating on the various weapon systems, communication systems, whatever else you used in your job in the military. And the more that you do that, the more of an expert that you become. It also forces you to rethink how you present that information. And in doing that, it makes you a better presenter, which helps to improve your authority status. So how do we teach others? Well, creating content is a great approach. The more content you're creating, not only are you showing your expertise, but you're also out here training the algorithms behind social media to show your content to more people. So now you're demonstrating your expertise, but also reaching a larger audience. Public speaking is another great one. I know a lot of people hate this because they feel uncomfortable getting on stage and talking. I highly recommend it because it's going to really, once you get through that and you get to a point where you're comfortable with it, it's going to boost your confidence, and it's going to help further boost that authority status that makes you stand out from your competitors. One-on-one conversations on the topic and podcast interviews are also great ways to do this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull up Dr. Carlos Garcia, and we're going to have him share some of his advice. He works with a lot of people on topics like this, psychologist, also a Marine Corps veteran. Rah. Carlos, brother, good to have you on with us.
Good to be here, my friend. Always lovely to sit down and have a chat with you.
Amen. So let me get your thoughts. When you run into somebody who's dealing with imposter syndrome, what are some of the first things that you work with them on to improve that situation for them?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, and this is something, I just gave a talk about this over the weekend, and something that I just consistently see with my clients and in my practice. The first thing I want them to have is an understanding of why imposter syndrome is coming up, right, and what it is. And essentially, right, like my understanding of it, Jeremy, is imposter syndrome is happening because there is a gap between reality, right, what your expertise actually is, or how people view you, and your self-perception of yourself. Oftentimes we are not, and ego has a lot to do with this, but oftentimes we're not the most accurate perception of ourselves. So, we'll have people say to us, and a lot of the places where I see imposter syndrome coming up is with like high performers, like athletes, executives, just high level people that are not able to see the sort of value in themselves, which is really, really interesting. Now it can go the other way, which is I think what you were talking about earlier, which is when that ego and self-esteem aren't on a solid foundation, we're likely to want to feel like imposters because we actually are. Because we're trying to be more than what we are, right? And that's a whole self-esteem thing. But really, what I want people to understand is that there is an inaccurate view of self, that they are not really perceiving themselves as good as they tend to be. Now, where does that come from? Really quickly, it has a lot to do with the environments and sort of like the environments that we grew up in, right? Oftentimes, we live in a society that's constantly telling us that we need to be better, that we need to be setting the mark higher, that we need to be setting the bar higher. And so, right, if your perception of who you need to be is always above where you are, then you're always going to be feeling like an imposter. You're never going to be feeling like it's enough, right?
Right. That brings up an interesting aspect of this that I've often wondered about. I feel like the people who are the most driven, right? You get your military, especially your tier 1 guys. You've got your entrepreneurs who are out crushing it. You've got your, top performing speakers, the guys and girls who are out there killing it, and they're always trying to do better and better and better. Do you feel like there's a correlation between that, where because they're constantly trying to do better, they're constantly doubting themselves at the same time because of that mismatch?
You said it earlier, right? Like, as you increase your expertise or your knowledge, the imposter syndrome is going to be there. Yes, and that's because of the environments that you're putting yourself up in as you increase your knowledge, intelligence, and experience. Right? Like, if you graduate high school and go teach kindergarten, you're not going to feel like an imposter, right? You like all day, right? You're like, look at these schmucks.
Yeah.
I know more than all of them, right? But it's as we increase our knowledge and skill set, we're continually putting ourselves in environments that are going to push us where we need to be better. And so that is one of the big drivers of imposter syndrome, is that as we're growing, as we're expanding in any area of our lives, right? As parents, as you know, executives in the military, whatever it is, we're always pushing ourselves to that next level. And that next level, right, means that you're intentionally putting yourself in a place to grow.
So how do we get over that, or not get over it, because you'll never completely get rid of it? But what tips do you have for really managing that as best as it can be managed?
Yeah, so you know, I'll use myself as an example, because I, you know, really struggled and suffered with this imposter syndrome a lot for many years. Part of what helped me was understanding why I had this imposter syndrome phenomenon going on within. So one example is, and this is right, I'm a psychologist, so this is kind of where I help people is in understanding their past. I grew up in a house with a father that had very, very little tolerance for mistakes, right? So the messaging that you received very early on as a child was always do better, failure's not okay, you know, you should see it as a weakness, or, you know, all of these different narratives that we adopt. I just happened to grow up with a mother that was just very opinionated, right? So it was always like, why wasn't I doing it the way she wanted or liked, or, right? And so, and then the third layer for me was an older brother who was a golden child. This kid could never do anything wrong. So from a psychological perspective, unknowing to me, in an unconscious way, my environment was constantly telling me that I was doing it wrong, that it wasn't enough, right? Now, you get put into school around the age of 4 or 5, and society's telling you, be better than all these kids, be faster, be better at math, right? Like, and then the overall message of society, which is like, your happiness or your sense of worth is tied to how much you achieve, right? The keeping up with the Joneses, the constantly needing to set that next sort of goal and that next metric. Well, all of that, right? All of that, we've been wired and conditioned by this belief system that only when we are hitting the top mark can we feel okay with ourselves. So for me, in my world, it's helping people see, like, how was this message conditioned within you? Because what happens for most of us is we keep hitting the metrics, right? Like, I got through the Marine Corps. I became a fireman. I was top of my class in paramedic school. I was crushing it getting my doctorate degree. But yet on the inside, I couldn't still see my worth the way other people were seeing it. So what I realized at that point, Jeremy, is like, oh, this isn't about more obtaining and more achieving and more degrees and more certificates. This is rooted in the way that I'm viewing myself. And if I can start to view myself more accurately, the way most people view me, then I can start getting rid of this imposter syndrome. And that's how I did it.
So you're tackling it more from a foundational level rather than trying to address the symptoms that you're currently dealing with right now.
Right.
Okay. Is that something that you think people can do on their own, kind of sit down and, you know, mind map that out and, you know, pros and cons or whatever? Or is that something that you feel like most people need a professional to help them with in some way?
You know, I think we can do it to some degree, but one of the things that all of us are challenged with are unconscious, right? Unconscious biases, unconscious fears, and just kind of the ways that we walk in the world with our blinders on, because they're just aspects of ourselves that we can't see accurately. I think that's where a professional, whether it's a coach, a good coach, a psychotherapist, a counselor, could sort of help to show us some of the patterns of thinking that we may have gotten indoctrinated into that we can't see ourselves. But I think we can do a lot of that work on ourselves. There's a lot of really great books out there that can help you. And a lot of this, Jeremy, is sort of what you said, right? We have to put our ego aside. We have to be willing to learn. We have to be willing to look at the aspects of ourselves that maybe we're not so happy with. Why is that there, right? But for me, that's the best thing we can do for ourselves. Is the better we know ourselves, the better we can sort of navigate those things within ourselves.
Love it, man. You just sparked an idea. Is that the kind of thing that you think, assuming people are willing to be kind of open with it?
Yeah.
Is that the kind of thing that you think could be worked through in a group setting, or is that more of a one-on-one situation?
Yes, brother. Like in about an hour here, I'm going to go in a group setting of some very high performing government executives and do this, right? And I just did it in a conference I was at this week. It's actually a more powerful place to do it because now you have other people in the room that share your experiences. And so when you start to invite conversation and invite curiosity, now people are willing to say, like, oh, wait, this isn't just me. This isn't a thing that I just struggle with. This is how it shows up for me. And there's this sort of normalizing, validating experience, which is what a lot of us often need, is like, oh, yeah, right. Of course I'm struggling with this, right? Like I grew up with parents that were, just really pushed academics or really pushed, and so that's a really great space in which this can happen. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, especially, getting out of the office and working one-on-one with folks to kind of bring some of these psychological principles to, teams, executive teams, business, because there's some really profound work that can happen there.
Nice. Well, then, if you're up for it, we should look at trying to do a workshop within the PRD community at some point, and kind of help some of these people get through that and see how you do what you do.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up here, Carlos, let's talk a little bit about your book, The Unseen Journey. This came out, towards the end of last year, if I remember correctly, right?
About 6 months ago. Yeah.
Awesome. So I had a chance to check that out, and you and I talked about it on a live towards the end of last year as well. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think the content in there is really useful for really anybody, but especially entrepreneurs who are really trying to get to that next level and get through their own bullshit that we all have.
Totally. Yeah. So, the book is a great tool. I wrote it in a couple of different, there's a couple of different things that went into that. One was just kind of me sharing my own experience of this, living this life of constant achievement and then really never feeling fulfilled, or like I was hitting, the metric I thought, which was like, oh, one day I'll feel like the expert, right? One day I'll feel like I've arrived, and why that, wasn't showing up for me. But really, it's an invitation to get curious about your own story, your own programming. One of the things I say as a psychologist is, in unconscious ways, by the time we're, 10, 11 years old, we're already so programmed by the environments that we grew up in. The sort of belief systems that we were sold by our parents, schools, churches, teachers, right? And not that any of that stuff is bad. Oftentimes it's really good, but some of it sometimes can be holding us back, and we don't even have an awareness of how that happens. So this book is really an invitation for you to go back into your past, to understand what were some of those environments you grew up in, what were some of the messages that you heard, how did those become beliefs for you, and how are they impacting you in a negative way, right? How are they blocking you? How are they creating fear? How are they creating ways in which you can't see yourself as accurately as you should, right? Like you said earlier, I think a lot of people that I work with, man, they're just like brilliant. They're amazing. They're rock stars in their world, and they just can't see themselves that way, right? And that's so sad. That like breaks my heart, because if these people were able to see like just how amazing they are, I think they would step into the world with so much more confidence and drive, and can create so much more impact in their respective worlds. So this book really helps highlight that for people.
Yeah, I think it's a great book, and everybody should definitely check that out. In fact, Chrissy, if you could drop that a link to that in the in this thread for today's video. I'd appreciate that. Carlos, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your insight, man. We'll definitely have to get you back on, and we'll do one of these workshops like we talked about there.
Sounds great.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. My pleasure. All right, everybody. So that was Dr. Carlos Garcia. Whoops. There we go. All right. That was Dr. Carlos Garcia. Great guy, brilliant psychologist, and a Marine Corps veteran. Christy will drop a link to his book in the chat for this video. Next up, we're going to talk about how to leverage public relations to show up in AI-driven search. Now, this is kind of a very early stage of this aspect of both public relations and search. But basically, what's going on is Google is becoming increasingly irrelevant. The results are worse than ever. If you guys have seen the AIOs, or the artificial intelligence overviews, where you Google something and then Google gives you an answer up top, those are straight trash. I covered this in some of the previous segments where we were talking about some examples of some of these AIOs. I don't remember all of them, but one that I remember in particular that really stood out was talking about if you have kidney stones, a good cure for that is to drink urine, which is both medically incorrect and absolutely repulsive. The results are also incredibly biased, and smaller publications, smaller websites are being suppressed. I've talked a bit about the HCU, or the helpful content update, which actually was just them cutting out small businesses and pushing big brands instead. But to some degree, Google is starting to lose market share as a result of this. It's not huge yet, I will admit that, but it is starting, and this is something that's really never happened before. You're also seeing search taking place in other places that is not where you might expect it to be. TikTok is one, for example. There was some research done recently by Adobe that, in this case, TikTok is currently deemed the 4th most popular search engine among what they call digital natives, falling just behind YouTube, Bing, and Google. Right now, over 2 out of 5 Americans use TikTok as a search engine. Now, that's not to say they only use TikTok, but they use it as one of their search engines. And nearly 1 in 10 Gen Zers are more likely to rely on TikTok than Google entirely, right? So as people start to turn more to AI, traditional search is becoming less relevant, and AI is becoming more relevant. And I think this is something that most of us see fairly frequently, right? We see somebody's like, oh, well, hey, I needed some ideas on marketing, or I needed some ideas on, sales or whatever. So I went to ask ChatGPT, or I went to ask Grok. And they're getting these ideas and implementing it in their business. So they're not just, putting in some keyword and scrolling through 10 blue links. They're now searching to get direct answers. And they're not getting good answers from Google in general. And they're getting even worse answers from Google when it comes to their AI. The AI from Google is absolutely horrible. And I think part of the reason that they're pushing it so hard in our faces is to try and force that adoption. If any of you guys use G Suite, you've probably seen that obnoxious prompt where it's, if you're in an email or you're in a Google Doc or anything, and it's telling you to use Gemini to create your document, to come up with ideas, whatever. There was one that was actually in a Super Bowl ad not too long ago here, where it was talking about Gouda cheese, and the AI generated answer said that something like over 50% of all cheese consumed is Gouda cheese. Well, that is factually incorrect. It just pulled this statistic out of its ass. Didn't exist. And that's the problem that we're seeing in a lot of these. But people are going to these AI tools to get their answers instead of going to search engines, instead of going to forums, instead of going to social media in many cases. So if people can't get answers about you on an AI platform, you're going to become less relevant and less authoritative, right? Now, obviously, there's going to be a bit of a runway here. This is not going to happen completely overnight. It's going to take some time before people completely move away from the traditional keyword type searches that go through, a Google or a Bing, and rely entirely on AI tools. But because of how technology is being implemented, it's going to come a lot faster than most people realize. I mean, hell, you pick up your phone and you tell Siri to put a thing on your calendar, or, call this person or whatever. We're relying on AI in a lot of ways that most people don't even realize, right? That Siri is AI. Obviously when you're going and asking ChatGPT for some marketing ideas or what kind of technology you should use to accomplish a particular task, that is obviously using AI. We all know that. But as the search results start to get worse, that's going to become more prevalent. And of course, as AI gets better, it's going to become more prevalent. So pretty soon, what's going to happen is you not showing up in these AI platforms is going to be the same at that point as you not showing up in search, right? If somebody Googles your name or Googles your business name and you don't show up in search, people are going to think you're a fraud. They're going to think it's a scam of some sort. It's going to be the case pretty soon where if you don't show up in AI tools, you're going to be perceived the same way. So how do we show up in these AI platforms? Well, by the way, if you haven't checked, I encourage you guys to go into Grok, go into ChatGPT, go into Perplexity, and ask it about yourself. And don't say me, right? Say your actual name, right? What can you tell me about Joe Smith? And see what it tells you. You'll find that a lot of you could be absolutely crushing it in business. You could be running an amazing business, highly profitable. You're seen as, a genius among your peers, but for whatever reason, you don't show up over there yet, right? So if that's the case, you definitely want to change that. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that you can do that. The first thing we're going to look at is the low-hanging fruit. So you should own your name as a domain name. Now, you may not be able to buy your name.com, but you could buy a different TLD, a top-level domain. And if you go into a lot of the registrars, you can see, and different registrars will have different TLDs available. But you go in and see what else there is, right? So maybe it's not the .com, but maybe you get joesmith.me or .pro, right? .club, whatever. There's I don't know how many there are, but there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different domain types that are available. And the interesting thing is, if you have one of these non-traditional TLDs, in many cases, they will rank higher in regular search engines than a .com. And ranking for your own name should be pretty easy anyway, unless you have a very common name. So your name as a domain, put up a website, put up some content, put up links to your social media profiles, put schema on your website, right? If you're not super technical, reach out to somebody who does web development, somebody who does SEO, who can kind of either do that for you or walk you through it for a fee. But schema is a thing that tells the bots on the back end how these things are related, right? So it's not keywords, it's entities. This is a person, this is that person's social media profile, right? That's what schema does. And if you've got your website and that's linking to those social media profiles, that helps you there. And then when it comes to your social media profiles, you want to make sure that they're complete, right? Have all the information in there that you can have in there. Obviously, you want to have your name. You want to have a solid profile picture, a cover photo. If you've got location info, put that in. If there's the ability to put a link to your site, put that in. And then you also want to post frequently, post useful content, things that show your expertise. You're giving people advice that they can follow and improve their life, improve their business in some way, even if they never become a client, even if they never pay you a dime, right? That's the kind of content that you need to be creating. And then you also want to engage. And this is especially important on X. The more that you're engaging, the more people that are going to see you and the more dots that are being connected in terms of A, the algorithms that are showing your content to other people, but also B, the connections that other platforms can use to tell your level of importance, your level of authority, right? Another thing you want to do is put up a podcast. You want to have a podcast. You want to post regularly. Once a week is probably the minimum that you want to do. But if you can get out there and do a brief podcast once a week, that's going to start building some information that these AI tools can find and pull data from, right? And then also go on other people's podcasts. So the more other people's podcasts, that's now expanding your footprint even bigger, and it's putting you in front of more of these tools. If you have the opportunity to get listed in IMDb, that's another great one. That's a little bit tougher because you have to be, in a movie or on a TV show, but it's doable. I'm in there. I know several people who are in there as well. And that's another thing that these tools look at, right? They crawl these authority sites, these sites that are well trusted and they've got vetted information. Wikipedia is another one. Wikipedia is incredibly difficult to get into. They've got very specific guidelines as to what they call notability. I have put some people in there, but I've also put a lot of people in there who should, in my opinion, and even in the opinions of many others in that person's industry, they should have been listed in there. They were, foundational to that industry, but because they don't meet Wikipedia's notability guidelines, they wouldn't allow them in, right? And they have specific criteria as far as what media outlets you have to have been featured in, how recent it has to be, how many of them there needs to be. But if you do have the ability to get into Wikipedia and you meet those criteria, absolutely do that, because that plays a big role. And then see if you've got a Google Knowledge Panel. So if you search for your name, does that pop up where you've got, the pictures and the videos and the website, across the top of the screen and down the right side? That's not a factor, it's an indicator. So the way this works is that is triggered algorithmically, right? It's not something that you go and sign up for or apply for or anything like that. Google is looking at a number of factors to determine your authority status, right? If they think that you're notable enough, then a knowledge panel will pop up. And if you've never seen one of these knowledge panels, if you Google my name, one will come up and it's got several large pictures across the top. Usually it'll have my X profile. It'll have some videos from some of the podcasts. And then down on the right side, there's another bar where it'll have some website. Sometimes it's my column, an entrepreneur. Sometimes it's my website. Sometimes it's other websites that I've written for. But basically, that is a thing that if that happens, then you are perceived by these algorithms as notable and important. So that is usually an indicator that you could likely be in some of these AI tools soon as well. All right, so this is super important. Definitely get out there and do that, because it's going to have a huge impact for you down the road. And if you do it now, you get out there, it's going to put you ahead of a lot of your competitors, so that when the time comes that the balance has shifted and now more people are using AI tools than traditional search engines, what you'll see is you will start gobbling up market share in your industry. So huge opportunity. Okay. Next up, we're going to talk about why most people fail to generate publicity for their book. And this is something that I see a lot. I've seen very smart people write what I consider to be great books, but they never get featured in the media. They never get any traction with it. They never sell anything. And the reality is most books actually don't sell much of anything. So let's talk about some of the reasons why most people don't get that publicity in the first place. First thing you have to look at is, does the content really matter? And what I mean by this is, are you writing for yourself or are you writing for the readers, right? And the way to determine that, because I've seen so many people have an idea in their head and they're like, this is a great idea, everybody's going to love it. And then they'll sit down and pour and pour and pour into that book. And then crickets. Nobody buys it. Nobody's interested in it. A way you could determine that ahead of time, so that you don't waste all that energy into writing the book that nobody's going to be interested in, is look at what happens when you discuss the topic, right? Whatever your book is about, if you're talking about it on social media, if you're talking about it to people, if you're talking about it on a podcast, do people genuinely get really excited about it? Are they asking you more questions? Are they trying to probe deeper into the topic? Or are they just kind of nodding their head and being like, yeah, okay, cool, waiting for their turn to talk, right? Or on social media, if you're posting some of the principles that your book is going to be based on, and you're not getting comments, you're not getting likes and shares, then that's a pretty good sign that the topic just doesn't resonate with people. And it doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It doesn't mean that, you're not smart. It just means that that idea is not resonating with people. It may be a simple matter of tweaking the content, tweaking the presentation of it. Like, there's a lot of different approaches to this. And we are going to bring on, at some point soon, we're going to bring on, I've got a publishing expert who can talk a little bit more about some of this from a content perspective. But if you're not getting that engagement, people aren't getting passionate about the topic, then it's pretty clear to see that this is not something worth writing a book about at that time. Doesn't mean you can't regroup. Doesn't mean you can't figure out a better way to approach it, but it's not going to work if people aren't engaging. And then your title is key. So I'm going to be honest and say most titles suck. All right. They're playing it too safe, right? It's boring. It's bland. It doesn't really say anything. It doesn't elicit any emotional response. It's just a, very fact-based title in many cases. And most people don't have the audience to be able to pull off a weak title. So if you want to really get some traction, your title's going to have to be a little bit edgier. Your title's going to have to be very bold. And I don't mean bold in a visual sense. I mean bold in a messaging sense. Grant Cardone had a great one called Be Obsessed or Be Average. Absolutely love that book. If you guys have not read it or heard the audio version of it, I encourage you to do so. A lot of great insight in there. But one of the things I love about it is the title is really bold and that it appeals to a certain group of people. And it's somebody who doesn't really resonate with that title is going to mean nothing to them, right? So you have to think of who you're trying to communicate with, and your title needs to, in a very punchy, tight little message, do that. Pitch Anything is another great one. Oren Klaff, super smart guy. I love his approach to sales, but that title is powerful because it conveys a very specific message. And if you're somebody who's in sales, that title means something to you. Another good example is Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. Another great book that you guys should check out. But basically, all of these titles are designed in such a way to laser focus on a very certain type of person. And the title's short, it's bold, and it gets the message across in a very powerful way. All right, so let's talk about actually getting the publicity for your book. So let's say you've got great content and you've got a powerful title. Where do we go wrong there? Well, most people start at the top. The truth is, big outlets, Entrepreneur, Fox Business, Newsmax, CNN, whatever, all of these large outlets are going to focus on large authors with a large following, right? They've already got a lot of people. And part of the reason is that author is going to be able to drive a lot of eyeballs to that segment or that article, right? So it's a kind of symbiotic relationship there. So if you're not any less of an entrepreneur if you have a smaller audience, but if you're an entrepreneur with, let's say you've got, 20,000 followers across all your platforms, well, then you need to be looking at outlets that are more aligned with your audience size. It's that social proof that's going to make a big difference as well. So it's not just that you can drive traffic to them, but having a large audience proves that your content is useful, that a lot of people are engaging in and consuming your content, and they find it useful. They want to see it. They want to read it. They want to hear it. And that indicates that their audience is going to want to hear what you have to say as well, right? Especially engagement. This plays a big role too, right? So it's not just the following, because anybody can buy a bunch of bot account followers, but do you have legitimate people engaging with your content on a regular basis? Are you getting likes and shares and comments? That plays a big role in whether or not they're going to bring you on as an author. Publicity is another factor. So if you don't already have publicity, and I don't mean publicity about the book already, I mean publicity about yourself already. Is your company being covered regularly? Are you as an individual being covered regularly? That's something that could be a huge piece of leverage, basically, that if you're already being featured and you're in a bunch of outlets, you're on a bunch of podcasts, that shows these outlets that you're somebody that other people have already vetted, and your content is good and useful and will help them by bringing you on, right? And then a huge one, and I see this so often, is your book is live, right? And if you're in pre-sales, that's a whole different story, right? If you don't have sales for your book yet, it's in that pre-order phase, which is something that Amazon does, where people can buy it before it's actually released. If you're in that, if the book is live though, and it's got no reviews, or it's got very few reviews, that's going to really hurt your chances of getting that book featured in the media, because there's no credibility there. There's nothing that shows that people have consumed that book and found value in it. So the media outlets are running a business just like you are. So if you're not showing them that their audience is going to find value in your content, they're unlikely to feature you. So make sure that you're getting a ton of reviews, right? And this can be as simple as asking friends to read your book and review it, right? It doesn't have to be millions of reviews, but you have to have something there. And of course, the more, the better. But it has to be substantive as well. So it's not just great book, highly recommend. There needs to be something to it that's going to give them some insight as to why that book would be valuable for them. We're actually going to be doing a workshop on book PR specifically at some point in time in the private community. But we'll talk more about that later. But the one thing I want you to remember is, whatever you do, whether it's you or whether it's an agency or a freelance, whatever, it's going to take far more work to get your book featured than you will ever expect. And it's one of those things where, if you're going to do it, be prepared to go all in, right? Don't start and then halfway through give up, or halfway through just kind of, take your foot off the gas and coast, because you're not going to get any results. If you want this to be effective, you're going to have to put in however much work it takes to get the outcome that you want. And this is important, because if you do that, then when you launch your next book and your next book and your next book, the results are going to be exponential. You're going to see far more traction with each iteration, right? My first book, I think the amount of reviews I had was, it was in the teens. I don't remember exactly how many it was, right? The last book that I published was, I don't know, somewhere around 40, 50, 60 reviews. I don't remember exactly how many it was. But the idea is, each time you go through this, your audience should be larger with each iteration. So you should get more traction. So put in the work, and that's going to help you further down the road. All right, we're going to close out the show with Jeremy's PR PSA. And that is, when you filter your message, you weaken your brand. And what we're talking about here is something that I see a lot on social media, and I see it a lot in public relations, where people will try to appeal to everybody, and they'll try to make sure that they don't turn anybody off. And when you do that, you're going to inevitably turn everybody off, because the things that would attract somebody to your brand are the same things that would push somebody else away. So if you're trying to eliminate everything that would push somebody else away, then you're also not going to attract anybody. And this means taking a stand. This means having a hard line on certain topics, whatever it is. And this doesn't mean you have to become this brash asshole and, run out there and try to offend everyone or attack people all the time. That's not what I'm saying at all. But you have to have a stance and really stand for that, right? Your messaging needs to convey exactly what you think, and you can't really waver on that. And when you do that, when you take that stand, what that's going to do is that's going to draw the right people to you if you're being authentic when you do that. All right. So don't be afraid to get out there and turn some people away. That's okay, because most of those people were never going to be your clients or your customers to begin with. So that's my PR PSA for the day. And wanted to give you guys a heads up on a few things. We are going to be launching the Spartan community. This is the private VIP paid version of Public Relations Declassified, where we're going even deeper into some of the topics that we're teaching. We've got some special tools out there. I know some of you guys have had a chance to beta test some of these tools. We're going to be posting a link to join that group probably next week. But awesome tools in here that will help you guys market more effectively, help you guys build a stronger brand, get out in front of more people. A lot of information that we're sharing in there that we're not sharing publicly as well. We've got a couple of cool workshops coming up that we'll be talking about. But that's going to be coming. In the meantime, if you guys found this valuable, I would love it if you'd invite people to the Facebook group that we've got. I think we've got the QR code is up over there. The screen is flip-flopped here. But yeah, if you hit that QR code, it will take you to the Facebook group. If you're not already a member, that is the free Public Relations Declassified Facebook group. If there's anybody that you know of that you think could benefit from this information, I would love it if you guys could invite them in or share this information, or whatever you think might be useful for them. Before we wrap up, Chrissy, do we have any questions that we want to bring up here?
The only question on Facebook, David Bell wanted to know, what if you don't show up in Grok?
All right, great question. Okay. I'm assuming everybody could hear Chrissy asking that, but if in case the tech was not working for us today, David Bell asked, what do you do if you don't show up in Grok in this case, but AI tools in general? So the answer is, like we talked about, it comes down to the publicity. We talked about some of the places that you need to be, have your website, have your social media profiles, but then the publicity and these high authority sites, that's where these AI tools are getting their data from. So if you're featured in these, and David, I know you're in, you've got 2 recent articles in Newsmax, but you've been featured in a lot of media over the years. So you probably will start to show up in there soon, but we'll talk more about that. There's some other things coming that will help with that. But ultimately, it comes down to being featured in these high authority media outlets, these high authority directories, IMDb, Wikipedia, major news outlets, things like that. So it's not an instant thing. So it's generally not, you get featured in one article and boom, you're there. They are looking at newer information. Obviously, they've crawled the internet and consumed gobs and gobs and gobs of data out there. But they're looking, especially now, at newer stuff. So as you continue to get featured, that's going to play a big role in you being in Grok and some of these others like ChatGPT and Perplexity and so on and so forth. All right. And if you have any other follow-ups on that, just let me know. Chrissy, that was the only one. So I guess we'll call this a wrap for today. Carlos, if there was anything you wanted to ask or share, I know we still got you here in the green room back here. Was there anything Carlos wanted to pop in with before we wrap up here?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for having me on today, but I kind of just been backstage listening, and just the value you're able to give this community with all of this information is just amazing. I even took a few notes. We'll have to chat later on about that.
Sounds good, brother. Well, I appreciate that. And as always, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge as well. And again, for anyone who may be checking in after, if you guys weren't around for Carlos's interview earlier, I definitely encourage you checking out his book, The Unseen Journey. Excuse me. Chrissy.
I will say, Jeremy, it just came out on Audible, so I know for a lot of achievers and people that don't have time to sit down and read, that's a better format.
For all the Marines that can't read.
That's it.
All right, and I think Chrissy dropped a link to that in the Facebook group as well, so you guys can grab that up on Amazon. All right, everybody. Well, that's a wrap for today. Carlos, thanks for joining us, brother. We'll get you on again with the workshop that we talked about. And for everybody else, look forward to seeing you all in the next episode. Thanks, everyone. All right. How was it?